Hi, Kimberly. Welcome to This is Motherhood. I am so delighted to see you because I stalk you on Instagram. And I know that you have all these wonderful roles and titles that you play, including the creator of Black Breastfeeding Week, a 5-time author, and your your Twitter bio says you are a change agent for maternal and infant health. That is a lovely list of things that you do. But I want to start with an icebreaker and ask you if you were going to Target, you only had 5 minutes to shop. Which section of the store are you hitting first so you can maximize your 5 minutes?
I'm going to the personal care items section because I could like lotioning and body oils are kind of like my one form of self care. So I'm going there to see what's the latest and the greatest of body butters, oils, lotions, hair creams, you name foot butters, you name it. That's where I'm at.
Staying moisturized is a priority, and you know that Target can help you do that. Go into that section. That's great. So, I want to start with your background and what led you on this journey of where you are right now as such an outspoken advocate for maternal health and infant wellness. So, what happened in your experience as a first time mom that started you on this journey?
Well, I like many people, motherhood really transformed me. I am a journalist by trade and was having a wonderful career in journalism. Quite honestly, not thinking about having children, and became a mother, and everything really shifted for me. And one, as a journalist, I think during my pregnancy, I was doing a lot of research, probably too much research, if there is such a thing. And probably as a journalist, I had tools that other people didn't have at the time, and was deeply concerned about what I was learning around, maternal health outcomes in our country overall, but also specifically what was going on with Black women. And, I was blessed to be educated, I was blessed to not be poor. And I had no idea that these were not protective factors for me. In fact, as you know, the studies show that college diplomas and income are not protective factors for Black women as they are for white women, right? White women's outcomes improve with education and income, but that has not been the case. And that really scared me. That really scared me. I just did not know. And so, as I began on this journey of discovery, more importantly, the answers that I was finding did not seem satisfactory. And so, my very first book, which came out way back in 2007, The Mocha Manual to a Fabulous Pregnancy, was the first kind of sociocultural examination of what's going on with Black women in pregnancy and childbirth by saying, what are the things going on in our lives that may be contributing to these outcomes, right? And so the book covered everything from your finances to your relationships to the role of racism to the stressors perhaps of being the only person of color at work. All of these things which we know are about lived experience. So, that part of my own research. And I would say the second thing that really shaped me was what happened to me in childbirth. I was just finishing grad school at Columbia, had did all this research once again, looking for a great place to deliver my baby, and end up having a very traumatizing experience. I'm grateful that I'm here to share about it, but it was mostly a lot of dismissiveness, a lot of undermining what I wanted to do. I said that I was breastfeeding. They gave my baby formula repeatedly against my wishes. I had to fight to have my baby with me while I had read that this was the standard practice of care for mothers and babies to be together. And I was just like, what is happening? Why am I having the exact opposite experience of everything that I read in the reviews, in the articles, in the parenting blogs available at that time? And Joyce, the reality was at that time in my life, I was not yet married and I was finishing up grad school, so I was on student insurance. And so I was treated like an unwed Black woman with basic insurance. And that feeling never left me. This idea that people are not being treated the same way at the same place. And so that was really my inspiration for creating the Earth app as a place for Black and Brown women and birthing people to see reviews from other people like them, right, around their OBGYNs, hospitals, and pediatricians. And so I feel like those two key moments really activated me and catapulted me into this work of advocacy and thinking about how we can change the pregnancy and and breastfeeding and motherhood experience for all, but also looking at this unique subset of Black women as well.
You mentioned the Earth app, which is the birth app, but you took the B off for bias. I downloaded your app. I looked at it, even as someone who has a 12-year-old, and I have no intents of having another child. I wanted to get an idea of what new moms, even experienced moms like me, can see when we go on the app. And kind of like you described, it's like reviews, it's experiences, it's based on you can identify yourself by your race, by your gender, by all of these categories and share your experiences with an OBGYN practice, with a maternity ward. This is what I needed back in 2009 when I was pregnant and new to Atlanta and knew no one. What is the goal of having women, and even when people who don't identify as women, because I noticed some of the gender identities that were on there that left a lot of, categories to kind of tick off to include everyone. So what can people who are about to give birth, have recently given birth, what can people find on this app that's going to be helpful to them?
Well, one of the most important things that they can find on the Earth app, like you said, it's like the word birth, but we dropped the B for bias, is to find community, right? And like I said about my experience, and I created Earth because, like you, I wish I had it. I wish I had a place at that time in my life to find a review from another Black woman or a single Black mother, right? But it just wasn't available. And so this idea that one, you can use your community as a resource, right? So we're always talking about the things that can help, particularly Black and brown parents have a empowered experience. Well, your community is a resource. Checking in to see what other people like you have experienced at a provider or a hospital is critically important. It's really one of the first steps around how we can become smarter and use our own consumer tools to do better in the birth experience. But the most important thing that Earth does is on the back end, we turn these reviews into data to work directly with hospitals, payers, and providers so they can learn how to improve our care by listening to us, right? It was deeply troubling to me, Joyce, that as I was doing all this work, I would constantly meet folks who do these maternal mortality review boards. They're very important. Most states have them. Your state has one. But this idea of analyzing what goes wrong after a death is deeply disturbing to me. Why do we wait until someone dies to figure out what went wrong in their care? And this ignores the whole spectrum of grief, harm, disrespect. People like me who did not die, but certainly had a lot of birth trauma, a lot of birth regret. And so with Earth, we say we can learn from the living. Right? Let's learn from the living. So how do we take this idea of sharing our experience, this lived experience, turn it into meaningful data and actionable strategies to work directly with hospitals, payers, and providers so they can learn from us, right? And so one of the most important things users find is an opportunity for their experience to matter in a way that may not matter on other surveys that kind of go one way, right? So you get to inform and protect your community, but you know that that review is being aggregated with others to now become a tool for change. And so that's really our proposition to users. We also have an amazing content community that we just launched. You can add location notifications to get alerts for reviews in your area. So it really is a tool for us to see what's happening. And even if you gave birth a while ago, please leave a review, because sometimes people, even when we're working with hospitals, sometimes it's helpful to really understand that someone 10 years ago had the same experience. This isn't a new problem at your facility, right? And sometimes I see reviews, people just need to share. They've had some drama, they've had some trauma, and they just need to share. I'm giving myself goosebumps thinking about a review that I recently read. But, just because it's not, our target is around the past 2 years, but we invite everyone to share their reviews because one, it does help on the back end, and two, it most definitely is a value to our community.
Well, Kimberly, one of the things that stand out to me is that the maternal morbidity rate among Black and brown moms has been making headlines a lot for the last 2 years, as well as during the pandemic. There were a lot of women who were not able to go to the hospital or birthing centers with their partners, with their spouses, with their families. And I can say, as someone who had a white physician, I had a scheduled C section, I had a picture perfect delivery, I felt like I was on the other side of that in a good way. What do you think is the value in sharing those positive experiences too? Because sounds like you just don't want the negative or unfortunate or bad experiences that women have to be shared on the Earth app.
Absolutely. In fact, this is a common misconception. So thank you for asking this question. Most people come on earth to say, this provider was awesome. Please, I want other people to go there. That is actually a larger proportion of the people who come to share on earth. And that's really important because we want to direct and use our community power to influence, right? And so, my vision for earth is that it becomes our good housekeeping seal of approval, and that doctors will want to brag and say, hey, do you know I'm earth approved, that we've got 5 stars? And that is actually the goal, so that every provider wants to be approved by our community. Not that we have a place for negative experiences, but we are using our power to drive the industry to actually pay attention, to drive transparency and accountability. We know that unfortunately there hasn't been a lot of accountability and a lot of transparency, particularly for Black birthing people. And so we want to use technology and digital platforms to address that, and also to say we have power, right? And so your experience as a positive one is even more important to share with Earth, because we want folks to know about that provider. We want others to go to him and support him and say, hey, we heard from other Black and brown folks that you treat us respectfully, and that matters to us, right? And so this is how we can actually start a race to the top, an actual race to do better, by sharing where folks are doing well, and then using that. And then the other thing I would say about that, Joyce, is on the back end, we want to know, hey, what has that provider done that can be helpful to others? We want the learning. So when we see hospitals and providers who are consistently well reviewed, we want to figure out what's going on there and how can that be a lesson that can be replicated and given to the field, because we need that.
You mentioned that during your first birthing experience, although you explicitly said you wanted to breastfeed your baby, you did not feel heard, you did not feel validated. Your child was given formula against your will, for lack of a better word. So breastfeeding has been something that's important to you. And I can say, I heard about Black Breastfeeding Week before I knew you personally, but it was great because I've shared about it on my blog. I've shared the experience of breastfeeding a child with allergies and what that takes. Why do you think, or what are the factors that lead Black women to not feel supported when it comes to breastfeeding, or having lower rates of breastfeeding than white mothers?
Yeah, well, we have to first of all acknowledge the historical context of what happened to Black women, particularly in their breastfeeding journeys. During enslavement, we were often stopped from breastfeeding our own children and forced to breastfeed the children of our oppressors. Also, if you look at the slave narratives, because breastfeeding impacts fertility, many times when we were breastfeeding, we were forced to stop breastfeeding because they wanted us to birth more babies, right? Because Black women were viewed as breeders and feeders. And at that time, our children had economic value. So it was lots of complex factors that didn't allow us to have that true motherhood experience. As you know, we could not own our children. We could not protect our children. They were not ours during enslavement. And unfortunately, many Black mothers, and I have a 17-year-old Black son, feel that we still can't protect our children, right? And that we still have that same anxiety of our ancestors. More goosebumps. But that is very real. That is very real for us in our motherhood journey. And so this idea of our initial experience as motherhood, like feeding your babies, your first job, being so corrupted and disrupted by a racial system, right? By a racist structure, right? And that actually had generational impacts. So even in my work with the Kellogg Foundation, where we were on the ground, and the work that we do with Earth, we often hear older relatives who still have a negative connotation, right? There's something about this generational trauma that was passed on of breastfeeding as something we did for other people, but we didn't do it for ourselves. Even after enslavement, when we had very few job opportunities, wet nursing was something that we were other women of color were often paid to do. So this idea of breastfeeding not being ours and something that we owned and something that we were able to do in the ways that white motherhood was not corrupted is something that we are reversing. And so we think of breastfeeding now as reclamation work, right? We think of us taking back something that was taken from us in a very powerful way because we've paid the price in our maternal and infant health outcomes, right? And what these early documents showed was that this disruption of breastfeeding led to this narrative of our infants being sick more often, right? And so, and of course, at that time, there were less, even less nutritious alternatives. And so, but this narrative of our infants being more sick has not ever changed. And so we can't really have a present day conversation about Black breastfeeding and body feeding without acknowledging the historical impacts that have led to where we are today. And then during Black Breastfeeding Week, we celebrate the joys of us reclaiming that, honoring that, holding systems accountable, to your point, for giving us the support that we need. My work around First Food Deserts was showing that breastfeeding and body feeding support should be like we want our food, right? Easily
Right.
accessible, hyper local. And so that's what we need for all Black and brown mamas to feel support in breastfeeding. And then we need to create more visual representations of us doing it. Just knowing that it's happening. This is where social media has just been amazing.
I was going to acknowledge what you just said about, being able to scroll through Instagram even and seeing so many Black women who are Black and brown women who are breastfeeding their children, who are, tandem breastfeeding, doing all of these amazing things that we did not get a glimpse into years ago.
Mm-mm.
And I think that with the Earth app, with Instagram, with social media, motherhood in tech is having a time. Do you agree?
Oh, I agree 100%. I agree 100%. And I think that's just a
So, how
natural
can we,
progression.
yeah, I was going to say, how can we build on that, support that? I don't know, share that even more?
Well, I think that, there's an old saying, what is it, like necessity is the mother of invention, right? Or something like that. But the fact that creativity and innovation is connected to a mother, and birthing something for me is very critical to this moment, and understanding that so many things that we have innovated in this field have because mothers and parents have said this is needed, right? We have always been the ones who have brought the products, right, the things to the market, knowing from our lived experience. And so the fact that this is naturally evolving to technology platforms from, perhaps consumer products and things like that is just a natural evolution, but very much on brand for what mothers do, right? And so I think of me kind of birthing not just Earth, but also the Birthright podcast, where we focus on joyful stories. Like these are all the things that we are building from what we see happening as parents. And I think these intersections are critically important. Because we've always been innovators and creators, and we know that it is up to us primarily to create the things that we need to have the motherhood experience that we deserve.
I think that's so important because so many of us, like me, I was not in the same city or state as my mother or my sisters or my support network when I had our son. So many of us live further away from loved ones, from grandparents, and motherhood forces you to find these solutions, or motherhood forces you to find these communities, and being able to use the Earth app, being able to listen to podcasts like Motherly and the Birthright podcast. I think that they give women more of a community than we've ever had before.
Absolutely. And it's just been phenomenal. And I think, you and I have been talking about motherhood for a very long time, and all the nuances of it. But to see this kind of growing, and what I also say, it's not just the community, but you can find pretty much any community. And I think one of the things that I was deeply concerned about was the ways that motherhood was often romanticized and glamorized, right? I would talk about motherhood being like you're in a meadow full of daisies and everybody's, got combed hair and it's beautiful. And that's not real. I remember remember like trying to use wet wipes to take a shower. It's like, this is the real stuff. And I think one of the beauties of technology, social media, and this community that we've created is for us to rip off some of that mask, because that was very stifling for so many people, right? It was actually causing more anxiety than doing good. And so now that we can say
Right.
people are showing their stretch marks, showing what postpartum bodies really look like, talking about postpartum mental health, talking about what really is a snatchback, all of these things can help us normalize, and not have the kind of media and Hollywood portrayal of motherhood, but for us to create that, which for me allows people to see themselves and see their journey more often.
Now, I'm a journalist like you. I worked in TV. You have more experience in print and have written, like I said, 5 books. But one of the articles you wrote is titled Black Breastfeeding is a Racial Equality Issue. How can we close the breastfeeding gap, aside from, Black Breastfeeding Week and some of those other things? You've acknowledged the cultural issues that are so deep, that are so ingrained. But what can we do to close that gap?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do, well, the first part is always around acknowledging why we're here, right? So we can't just act like there's no history to this. And so I think one of the most important things what we've done is try to work with those who are doing training, those lactation consultants, for them to understand how our culture can be different, right? And that may include the fact that we don't have generational role models. We may not have mamas and aunties who breastfed. The role of grandmothers being really, really important. I would always say to people, they're like, well, tell your grandmother that you're breastfeeding and tell her to blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, we don't talk to our grannies like that. That's not going to work.
That's true.
That's not going to work.
That is very true.
So how do we have more culturally appropriate understanding, and also realizing that many of us may use grandparents for childcare, et cetera, et cetera. Many Black and brown folks live with extended family where that granny, that grandma may be helping to take care of this infant. And so what is that dynamic like? The role of fathers and the men in our community being supportive of breastfeeding just because the breast has become such a hypersexualized body part. How do we bring them into the conversation? And then also this very real point of making sure that we have groups, right? When I had my first child, I was living in the suburbs. I went to a La Leche League meeting. Thank God it was there, but there was nobody there who looked like me, and there was nobody there
I
who
had the exact same experience, Kimberly. I
was
was the
going
only
back to
Black
work.
mom at some of these lactation meetings.
Yeah, yeah. And so how does the movement, and I talk about this in my book, how does the movement acknowledge its past and do that extra equity work, which means doing more to now invite Black women to the table and brown women to the table and say, you all are welcome here. What does that look like for them? And for these resources, not just to be in suburban neighborhoods, but in places where we know Black and brown people disproportionately live, which includes some suburbs, but not always, right? And so that's the work that needs to be done, making this support hyper-local, make sure the folks who are supporting breastfeeding are also diverse. You can't fix a problem when you reflect the problem. And so we've been working really hard for more Black IBCLCs and more Black lactation consultants. And so diversifying the field from the bottom up as well, because representation matters. And so these are so many great things that are now going on to help move this needle. And then to your point, the visual the representation, people seeing themselves, whether it's on social media or in their community, knowing that people like them are doing it, I think is just going to be powerful. So we're excited, and I'm excited and honored to see all of this energy and movement in the Black breastfeeding space, which we know will have an impact.
And I think it's important to share all the intricacies, the ups and downs, the successes, the failures that you encounter as a breastfeeding parent, because I never would have imagined going into this journey that I would breastfeed a child with food allergies and have to change my diet for 2 years. No one told me that.
Right.
No one told me that's a possibility.
No.
I heard about, the letdown, and I heard about cracked nipples, but I'm like, someone needs to talk about this aspect. And I find that when I am vocal about that, even though my son is 12, I may share something from an old blog post about nursing a child with food allergies. People are so amazed, and other mothers who've had that experience feel recognized. So sharing all the little nooks and crannies of breastfeeding, I think, are important too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a universal experience for anybody, right? No two breastfeeding journeys are exactly the same. It just doesn't happen. And I think that has been part of where we are doing the course correction, to not say just overly simplistic things like breast is best. It's like, well, that's true, but what about me? And so, trying to have
Exactly.
a more nuanced approach, whether that means about allergies, whether that means around your mental health, whether that means, all sorts of nuances. And this idea of us kind of personalizing and customizing our birth and breastfeeding journeys is part of, I think this important revolution that's happening, and technology is a part of how we're able to do that as well. And first of all, just want to say shout out to you for changing your own diet to adjust and to continue with that commitment for your son, because I know what a commitment that is. So, kudos to you and all the hands up.
I remind him of that in the C-section scar and the stretch
Absolutely.
marks.
And
You
you
can use
should.
this
And you should.
as guilt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I still pull out the C-section scars. So, and I don't even have the breastfeeding with allergies. So, absolutely. Totally co-sign.
Now, one of the ways that you are also advocating for Black maternal health, brown maternal health, wellness, and infant health is with the Birthright podcast. So tell us how you started that and what are some of the episodes that stand out in your mind that were, just so on time, so relevant, and so informative.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I mean, as we're both journalists, I have been deeply concerned about the narrative that was happening in Black maternal health, which was always focused on stories about death, negative statistics. This idea of us being newsworthy in our demise was deeply troubling to me, as a storyteller, as a person who's very concerned about narratives. And so I was like, well, first of all, we can learn from positive experience. Things can and do go well for Black women, and we need to learn from that too, right? And it's not just learning from the negative, we can learn from the positive. And for me, joy is always a part of how we can continue and sustain ourselves. This is how our ancestors survived, right? By always finding opportunities for joy, making joy even out of unpleasant situations. And so I think that is something I wanted to bring to the birth equity movement, to say, hey, where's the joy in this, right? It can't just be all doom and gloom.
Yes.
And so I started Birthright really to tell positive Black birth stories, as a learning tool, and to say that we can learn from these too, and we must. Right. And then for people who are listening to know that a positive birth experience is possible, and it doesn't have to be a miracle. We can learn what this person had in place, what was done, what they used, blah, 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 blah. And so we can start developing what is that recipe and how can I emulate it, versus the goal being, I just don't want to die. Because we got too many DMs and messages on Earth where it's like, should I write a will before I'm going in to give birth? I mean, these are real questions that people are asking us. Yes, deeply concerning. And so, how do we insert positivity into this narrative? So that's what Birthright does. It focuses on joyful stories, and I don't define what joyful is, right? For if that person feels like it was a positive experience, they are invited onto the show. And so some of the episodes I felt really impactful. One of them was Whitney Robinson. She was in season 1, and she ended up having I think they call it an ultra preemie at like 28 weeks. And
Oh,
obviously,
gosh.
it was just not anyone's intended outcome for a birth. But she was supported. She ended up, I mean, you have to listen to the episode because it was really just amazing. The confluence of events that came together, a straight miracle. She ended up being supported by 2 midwives. And a doctor who allowed them to let her birth her baby. But she was able to play her music, get up on all fours, and do what she wanted to do. Ooh, my goosebumps remembering that episode. Um, and, have her husband there, and, like just her joy and taking this really not desirable outcome, but turn it into an experience where she felt empowered, is one of my favorite episodes, because it really embodies what we're talking about, which is it doesn't necessarily mean that everything went according to plan, right? That rarely
Right.
happens. But it meant that you were seen, you were heard, right? You were
You were
allowed to have, you were
validated.
validated, you were allowed to do something that mattered to you, right? Um, and that you were able to come out of that feeling whole and complete, not disgusted, depressed, and traumatized, as Whitney did. And then she began her journey as a NICU mom, and so that's one of them. And then this season, we just last week had an episode with Christina Elmore, who played Condola on the HBO hit series Insecure.
Hmm.
And we had, because Cadola was such a great character, but also was pregnant and mentioned breastfeeding on the show. So I was the person, when I watched the episode and she mentioned a lactation consultant, I was screaming. I was screaming because I was like, someone said lactation consultant on HBO, right? Like these are culture
Yes.
shifting moments, right? And the ways that she had her postpartum body, which was because she was literally postpartum while shooting, and she had a doula. And so we had a great conversation about the ways that Hollywood can shift our expectations around Black motherhood, and the power of such small things being included in scripts. They had another character who literally said during the series, "Is there a Yelp for maternity care?" And I was yelling, "Yes, there is. That's called her." So I yell a lot at the television. It's fine. But there was, so we had a really powerful conversation about the ways that Hollywood, and then more Black women in Hollywood, are shaping and changing our understanding, normalizing doulas and things like that, in our birth experience. So that was a great episode as well. So many great
Oh my
episodes.
gosh. Yes, I definitely want to listen into those. Before we go, Kimberly, I want to know, you've been doing so much work with books, with working, with articles, with your podcast, with the Earth app. What still needs to be done? Are there two or three things that you think we as a community that supports mothers can do to improve Black and brown maternal wellness and infant wellness?
Such a great question. I think that you're so right. Like we need to get into action. Like we've been in this awareness mode, and it's time to focus on
Mm-hmm.
solutions, because the fact of the matter is we do know what works. We know that doulas help improve outcomes. We know that actually childbirth centers, and out of hospital births have better outcomes for Black women. We know that even within hospitals, midwife attended births, have better outcomes. And so it really is about what we can do to implement these solutions more regularly, right? And so, how do we as a community support, making sure that doulas are accessible via cost for those, thinking about those ways that we can make sure that the cost of doulas is accessible to all. How can we support, think about policy changes that need to happen for midwifery not to be criminalized? It is still illegal in too many
Mm-hmm.
places, right? So how do we support legislation and look at what's going on in our own state, put ourselves behind some policy changes so that childbirth centers can exist, midwives can thrive and not be illegal and criminalized for the great work that they do. And then we have to drive more accountability and transparency, right? We've seen this happening in every other industry, but unfortunately, the healthcare industry has been allowed to not be held accountable to the communities that they serve for the service and the work that they provide, right? And that is what Earth is about. It is about driving accountability, driving public transparency. And I think that's what's been missing. We have done enough, the trainings don't work. We've done enough trainings. Thank you very much. Right? Now we need transparency, and we need more accountability. And so I think those are the things that need to happen on a systemic level. And on a community level, what can we do to make sure the things are in place for these outcomes to improve?
Kimberly Seals Allers, thank you so much for talking to us on the This Is Motherhood podcast. Thank you for creating the Earth app and using tech to allow moms to share these important, integral stories, these amazing reviews, good, bad, otherwise, and in between, that can help them feel empowered and make the best decisions that they can for their family.
Thank you so much for having me.